In Celtic's history, many of the club's most celebrated moments have involved defeating a team playing out of Ibrox, whatever variant that might be. 7-1, 6-2, 5-0, 4-2 and so many others. These scorelines have become iconic parts of the Bhoys' heritage. This podcast tells a story of a first 11 of Celtic's most significant wins over Rangers. The starting point for this is obvious and takes us back to 1888 when Celtic beat Rangers 5-2. It's obvious because this is Celtic's first ever game. On the 28th of May 1888, the Bhoys played their first game, with Rangers agreeing to be the opposition, in the days before a more bitter edge would enter this relationship. The match was held at the original Celtic Park, close to the site of the modern day park. Around 2,000 fans were present to watch the Celts' maiden fixture. Those spectators cheered as the Bhoys' first ever goal was scored by Neil McCallum. Later in the match, James Kelly and a hat-trick from Tom Mealy added to this tally. By the full-time whistle, the Bhoys had secured a 5-2 victory. They were off the mark not only for winning games, but also for beating Rangers. Another very significant Celtic victory over Rangers came in 1904 in the Scottish Cup final. This cup final is one of the most historic moments in the competition's history, as well as Celtic's too. Many issues from this created a legacy that has felt even today. The 1904 Scottish Cup final was the first of its kind to be held at the third and current Hampden Park. The 65,000 supporters who crowded into the ground were immensely entertained. Rangers raced into an early 2-goal lead and the match seemed to be over. But at that point, stepped forward Celtic hero Jimmy Quinn. The Croy Express, as he was sometimes known, managed not one but 2 goals by half-time, ensuring that the Bhoys were level at the interval. And then, in the second half, Quinn completed Celtic's first ever Scottish Cup final hat-trick to seal an exciting 3-2 victory. As well as Quinn's hat-trick being the first for the Bhoys in such a final, this was also the first time that the Celts won a trophy whilst wearing hoops, having only switched the previous August. Not only that, the build-up to this game had been focused on the growing relations between Celtic and Rangers, and so the term Old Firm was born. It didn't take long for another significant Celtic-Rangers game to happen. In fact, the next one took place a year later at the same venue. By the end of the 1904-05 league title race, nothing could split Celtic and Rangers. The two sides had both finished the season on 41 points. This was at a time when other actions such as goal difference weren't used to separate tied teams. As a result, this meant that season's league title would be settled in a one-off playoff game. That match was fixed for the 6th of May 1905, taking place at Hampden. To ensure neutrality, an English referee called Fred Kirkham was appointed for the game. Throughout the entire 90 minutes, there was little between the teams. 3 goals were scored, and it all came in a 6-minute spell. Jimmy McMenemy put the Celts in front, and then David Hamilton doubled the lead only 60 seconds later. Rangers' John Robertson got on the mark 5 minutes later, but it was still the Bhoys who ultimately celebrated. As a result of this victory, Celtic had their first title of the 20th century. More significantly, this started the Bhoys on a world record 6 in a row league titles run, going from 1905 to 1910. The next game took place several decades after the last one, but it's fair to say it's very, very well known. Whilst victory in Lisbon in 1967 is the Celts' best game, the most recognisable and famous scoreline in the club's history has to be 7-1. In the opening years of the League Cup, Celtic generally struggled. However, in 1956, they finally won the trophy by beating Partick Thistle in a replay. A year later, the Bhoys were defending their trophy and they faced old rivals Rangers. Celtic generally struggled in this era. When they won at Ibrox in September 1957, it was their first win there for 22 years, so no one could have predicted the events that took place at Hampden on the 19th of October 1957. It was a relatively slow start, with no hint of the goals to come. but on 23 minutes, Sammy Wilson put the Celtic one up. It looked like staying like this by the break, until a minute beforehand when Neely Mochan doubled this advantage. Willie McPhail would have a wonderful day, and 8 minutes into the second half, he got his first, before adding to this 16 minutes later. In between these goals, Rangers had scored, meaning it was now 4-1 to the Celts. 5 minutes later, Mochan added to his tally, and on 81 minutes, Rangers well and truly collapsed as McPhail completed his hat-trick. A 90th minute penalty from Willie Fernie sealed an amazing day, and also set a British Cup final record scoreline. 9 years later came another significant match between Celtic and Rangers, but this time in the league. By 1966, the Celts had not won the title for 12 years, nor had they experienced playing in Europe's top competition. Thanks to wins like this against Rangers, that changed by the end of the season, and the following year they sat atop the pack in European competition. The Celts welcomed in the new year in their opening home game of 1966, playing on the 3rd January. In this all-ticket game, almost 70,000 crammed into Parkhead to see the Boys take on Rangers, despite the cold and foggy weather. When the match began, the Celts looked like they were going to enjoy a very unhappy new year. After only 90 seconds, they trailed the visitors, which was the same outcome when half-time was called. The second half, though, would be very different. 4 minutes after the restart, Stevie Chalmers first put his name on the score sheet. It wouldn't be the last time. In the 62nd minute, he repeated this, before Charlie Gallagher gave Celtic a 2-goal advantage. With 10 minutes remaining, Bobby Murdoch killed any hopes of a comeback. Finally, in the 90th minute, Chalmers got his third to become the latest Celt to hit an Old Firm hat-trick. Most importantly, these 2 points proved to be vital at the season's conclusion. Celtic won the title just 2 points ahead of their Ibrox rivals, and later they would look out their passports to head to Lisbon. 3 years later came another significant Celtic and Rangers game, this time in a cup final. In fact, it's very much a story of Celtic piling on the agony on Rangers, a song that is still sung about at Celtic Park. The 1969 Scottish Cup final was sure to be a close tie, or so it was believed. Rangers had enjoyed a huge 6-1 win over Aberdeen in the semi, and this showed they'd be tough opponents. A massive crowd of more than 132,000 were attracted to Hampden for the clash. Any worries that the Celts had about losing this trophy were very quickly eased. After only 3 minutes, Billy McNeill rose above all the other players to head home. Even at this stage, there was little hope for Rangers as the Boys battered them in the first half. Despite this constant pressure, Celtic couldn't extend their lead until just before half-time. 1 minute before the interval, Bobby Lennox made it 2, and then within seconds, George Conley put the lid on the Ibrox coffin with a third for the Celts. As the second half began, it was clearly a case of counting down until full time. The only question was whether the Celts could score again, and in the 76th minute, Stevie Chalmers added his name to the roster of scorers and completed a comprehensive 4-0 success. Not only was this a resounding win for the Celts, their biggest ever victory over Rangers in the Scottish Cup final, it also sealed the Boys' second ever treble. Unusually, all 3 of Scotland's main trophy had been won by Celtic in the same month. 10 years after this came an utterly iconic Celtic and Rangers game. The 1905 league title was decided in a playoff between Celtic and Rangers, but even the drama of that moment surely comes nowhere near the events of 1979. At Celtic Park, in the Hoops' final game of the season, they lined up against Rangers for the 3rd time in May. The Ibrox men had won the previous league game and also claimed the Glasgow Cup. This meant big problems for Celtic. The Boys knew that victory would mean that they were champions. However, defeat would surely give the title to Rangers, who still had 2 games left to play. On the 21st of May 1979, more than 50,000 fans made their way to Glasgow's East End. In this must-win game, the opening hour couldn't have gone worse. At half-time, Celtic were 1 down, and 10 minutes into the second half, Johnny Doyle was ordered off. It seemed Billy McNeil's hopes of winning the title in his first managerial season at Parkhead were going. But then, on 66 minutes, Roy Aitken gave them hope with a goal, before George McCluskey soon put them ahead. But just as quickly as things improved for Celtic, so they changed. 2 minutes later, the Ibrox men equalised. There were 5 minutes remaining and the boys piled forward, and they managed to force a third as Colin Jackson headed into his own net. And then on 90 minutes, a howitzer of a strike from Murdo MacLeod settled the game and title once and for all. What a match. 10 years after this was yet another significant Celtic and Rangers game, this time coming in the Scottish Cup final. By 1989, the direction of travel for Scottish football was becoming clear. Rangers' extra finances were giving them a major advantage, one that would allow them to dominate in Scotland for a decade. As the 1989 Scottish Cup final arrived, the Light Blues were heavy favourites to beat Celtic, and they were chasing a treble. However, the Celts knew this game offered their final chance of silverware for the season. Hampden Park was bathed in roasting hot sunshine, and 72,000 fans sweltered in the May heat. They watched two evenly matched teams in the first half, but then, just as the interval approached, Roy Aitken put out the ball and then took the throw-in anyway. As the Celts attacked, Ibrox defender Gary Stevens miskicked his back pass and instead played in the boys' Joe Miller. He fired home to give Celtic the advantage, and it was one they never relinquished. This wasn't just an exciting win, the match was also a small piece of history. This was the last time that Celtic beat the original Rangers in the Scottish Cup final. And it was the last time they would beat any Rangers team in such a match for 3.5 decades. Of course, this would also be the Celts' final trophy for 6 years, as they entered a spell of failure. However, this was one from which they would emerge under new ownership and on a path to major success in the 21st century. 11 years after this came another celebrated scoreline for the Celts. If there was ever a game which introduced and defined a manager's reign at Celtic Park, it was this victory in August 2000. Martin O'Neill had not long arrived at Celtic Park and had managed his first game just weeks before. Now he had a win that would be celebrated even decades later. Since the 1980s, Celtic had been in Rangers' shadow. One league title in the 1990s was a sign of the gap between the two. But with O'Neill's appointment, which was then followed by investment in high-profile signings, the tide was ready to turn. On the 27th of August 2000, it was time for the first Old Firm match of the season. Rangers enjoyed a raucous and devastating welcome to Celtic Park. Within 11 minutes, they were 3 goals down thanks to Chris Sutton, Stan Petrov and Paul Lambert. Although the Ibrox side hit back with 2 goals, their hopes evaporated following a stunning chip from Henrik Larsson, who then added a second. And in the last minute, Chris Sutton also made it 2 for the day and completed a 6-2 rout. When the final whistle sounded, the Celts cheered and looked forward to what was clearly a bright new dawn. By the close of that season, they had secured their first treble since 1969 and started on a path which has involved 21st century dominance. The next notable Celtic Rangers game came 8 years later. In 2008, it was very unlikely that the Celts were going to claim the league title, certainly for much of the season. It was also a time and an event that was tinged by sadness. For much of this season, the Celts had been well behind Rangers, and then 2 defeats at the end of March and early April, including one at Ibrox, looked to very much have ended Celtic's hopes for the season. On the 16th of April 2008, the Light Blues came to Celtic Park for a midweek match. It was the very definition of must-win for the Celts, and even doing this wasn't going to guarantee league success. The game started with a bang as Barry Robson clattered Rangers' Christian Daly to set the tone for the night. And then a stunning goal from Shunsuke Nakamura made it 1-0. Celtic Park was rocking, but a Nacho Novo equaliser levelled matters. Rangers knew they just had to avoid defeat. As much as Celtic pressed, it seemed their luck was out. Then in the 70th minute, hope seemed to be restored. Carlos Cuellar punched the ball off the Rangers line. He was sent off and the Hoops had a penalty. Scott McDonald stepped up and missed. Soon the 90 minutes had come and gone. There was only seconds remaining from Celtic's title hopes being packed up for the season. Then the ball came to Gary Caldwell. His diagonal cross found Scott McDonald, who headed across the goal, and in swooped Jan Vennegoor of Hesselink to bring pandemonium to the Celtic stands. After winning this game, Celtic still had much to do. 11 days later, Rangers were back at Celtic Park, and once more they left with nothing following a 3-2 win for the Boys. The Championship's destination eventually went to the last day of the season. Just days after the tragic death of Tommy Burns, the Celts were at Tannadice. They knew victory would mean they were champions, and a Vennegoor of Hesselink goal achieved just that. Other Celtic and Rangers games have taken place in more recent times, but in a slightly different context. In 2012, there was a big change in Scottish football as the original Rangers were liquidated, bringing an end to the concept of the Old Firm. However, in their place came another side. Regardless of how you view the modern day Rangers, an obvious rivalry still exists between Celtic and the team from Ibrox. Of all the many big wins Celtic have enjoyed against this new Rangers, perhaps the most significant and crushing came on the 29th of April in 2018. On this day, Celtic would not only secure a big win, but also be crowned league champions for the 7th successive season. The match started well thanks to odds on Eduard's goal, and then a 12-minute spell, which crossed the first and second half, saw the Celts blow away their rivals. 4 goals from Eduard, James Forrest, Tom Rogic and Callum McGregor made it 5-0. The only strange and disappointing aspect of the match was that even though the boys were 5 ahead with only 40 minutes remaining, they didn't add to their tally. But on a day when they sealed the title and crushed this second Rangers, it was very much a day for celebration. There's been lots of other fine Celtic wins over Rangers, although many stand out not for what they ultimately achieved, but instead as an oasis of cheer in otherwise poor seasons. The 5-1 victory in 1998 and the St Patrick's Day massacre and Palm Sunday humiliation of 1991 are good examples. From Celtic's earliest days, there's been a connection and then later a bitter rivalry with the clubs playing out of Ibrox. Many fans' favourite moments when following Celtic involve triumphing over either of these light blue teams. The games mentioned in this podcast have been some of the most significant victories for the Celts, helping bring success and glory to Celtic Park. So, what's been your favourite Celtic defeat of Rangers, whether it's version 1 or 2? If you want to learn more about Celtic history, follow Hail Hail History on Twitter, X and Blue Sky. You can also take part in free Celtic history walking tours. Visit celticwalkingtours.wordpress.com for more information.